This is the beginning of part 3 of A Summer's Reading by Bernard Malamud. For a few weeks he had talked only once with Mr. Catanzara, and though the changemaker had said nothing more about the books, asked no questions, his silence made George a little uneasy. For a while George didn't pass in front of Mr. Catanzara's house any more, until one night, forgetting himself, he approached it from a different direction than he usually did when he did. It was already past midnight. The street, except for one or two people, was deserted, and George was surprised when he saw Mr. Catanzara still reading his newspaper by the light of the street lamp overhead. His impulse was to stop at the stoop and talk to him. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, although he felt the words would come when he began to talk. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea scared him, and he decided he'd better not. He even considered beating it home by another street, but he was too near Mr. Catanzara, and the changemaker might see him as he ran and get annoyed. So George unobtrusively crossed the street, trying to make it seem as if he had to look in a store window on the other side, which he did, then went on, uncomfortable at what he was doing. He feared Mr. Catanzara would glance up from his paper and call him a dirty rat for walking on the other side of the street, but all he did was sit there, sweating through his undershirt, his bald head shining in the dim light as he read his Times, and upstairs his fat wife leaned out of the window, seeming to read the paper along with him. George thought she would spy him and yell out to Mr. Catanzara, but she never moved her eyes off her husband. George made up his mind to stay away from the changemaker until he had got some of his softback books read, but when he started them and saw they were mostly storybooks, he lost his interest and didn't bother to finish them. He lost his interest in reading other things too. Sophie's magazines and newspapers went unread. She saw them piling up on a chair in his room and asked why he was no longer looking at them. And George told her it was because all of the other reading he had to do. Sophie said she had guessed that was it. So for most of the day, George had the radio on, turning to music when he was sick of the human voice. He kept the house fairly neat, and Sophie said nothing on the days when he neglected it. She was still kind and gave him his extra buck, though things weren't so good for him as they had been before. But they were good enough, considering. Also his night walks invariably picked him up, no matter how bad the day was. Then, one night, George saw Mr. Catanzara coming down the street toward him. George was about to turn and run, but he recognized from Mr. Catanzara's walk that he was drunk, and if so, he would not even bother to notice him. So George kept on walking straight ahead until he came abreast of Mr. Catanzara, and though he felt wound up enough to pop into the sky, he was not surprised when Mr. Catanzara passed him without a word, walking slowly, his face and body stiff. George drew a breath in relief at his narrow escape when he heard his name called, and there stood Mr. Catanzara at his elbow, smelling like the inside of a beer barrel. His eyes were sad as he gazed at George, and George felt so intensely uncomfortable he was tempted to shove the drunk aside and continue on his walk. But he couldn't act that way to him. And besides, Mr. Catanzara took a nickel out of his pants pocket, and handed it to him. "Go buy yourself a lemon ice, Georgie." "It's not that time anymore, Mr. Catanzara," George said. "I am a big guy now." "No, you ain't," said Mr. Catanzara, to which George made no reply he could think of. "How are all your books coming along now?" Mr. Catanzara asked. Though he tried to stand steady, he swayed a little bit. Fine, I guess, said George, feeling the red crawling up his face. You ain't sure? The changemaker smiled slyly, a way George had never seen him smile. Sure, I'm fine. They're fine. Though his head swayed in little arcs, Mr. Catanzara's eyes were steady. He had small blue eyes which could hurt you if you looked at them too long. George, he said, name me one book on that list that you read this summer, and I will drink to your health. I don't want anybody drinking to me. Name me one so I can ask you a question on it. Who can tell? If it's a good book, maybe I might want to read it myself. George knew he looked passable on the outside, but inside he was crumbling apart. Unable to reply, he shut his eyes, but when, years later, he opened them, he saw that Mr. Catanzara had, out of pity, gone away. But in his ears, he still heard the words he had said when he left. George, don't do what I did. The next night, he was afraid to leave his room, and though Sophie argued with him, he wouldn't open the door. What are you doing in there? She asked. Nothing. Aren't you reading? No. She was silent a minute, then asked, Where do you keep the books you read? I never see any in your room outside of a few cheap, trashy ones. He wouldn't tell her. In that case, you're not worth a buck of my hard-earned money. Why should I break my back for you? Go on out, you bum, and get a job. He stayed in his room for almost a week, except to sneak into the kitchen when nobody was home. Sophie railed at him, then begged him to come out, and his old father wept, but George wouldn't budge, though the weather was terrible and his small room stifling. He found it very hard to breathe. Each breath was like drawing a flame into his lungs. One night, unable to stand the heat anymore, he burst into the street at 1 a.m., a shadow of himself. He hoped to sneak to the park without being seen, but there were people all over the block, wilted and listless, waiting for a breeze. George lowered his eyes and walked, in disgrace, away from them, but before long he discovered they were still friendly to him. He figured Mr. Catanzara hadn't told on him. Maybe when he woke up out of his drunk the next morning, he had forgotten all about meeting George. George felt his confidence slowly come back to him. That same night, a man on a street corner asked him if it was true that he had finished reading so many books, and George admitted he had. The man said it was a wonderful thing for a boy his age to read so much. Yeah, George said, but he felt relieved. He hoped nobody would ask him. He hoped nobody would mention the books anymore. And when, after a couple of days, he accidentally met Mr. Catanzara again, he didn't, although George had the idea he was the one who had started the rumor that he had finished all the books. One evening in the fall, George ran out of his house to the library, where he hadn't been in years. There were books all over the place, wherever he looked, and although he was struggling to control an inward trembling, he easily counted off 100, then sat down at a table to read. That was the end of A Summer's Reading by Bernard Malamud. Thanks for listening.